This is Sally Schessler, Director of Education for Allergy and Asthma Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Advances in Allergy and Asthma. This webinar series helps allergy and asthma live out our mission to end the needless death and suffering due to asthma, allergies, and related conditions through outreach, education, advocacy, and research. It is presented in partnership with the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. Today, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Angela Hogan, who will speak to us today about the risk factors for asthma and allergies. Dr. Hogan is a professor of pediatrics in the Division of Allergy and Immunology at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia, and the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters. She is a senior partner of the Children's Specialty Group. She is board certified in pediatrics and allergy and immunology. She graduated from the University of Louisville Medical School and completed her pediatric residency at Cosard Children's Hospital in Louisville. She completed a fellowship in allergy and immunology at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, a fellowship in clinical and laboratory immunology at Virginia Commonwealth University and Medical College of Virginia in Richmond, and a 4-year postdoctorate study in immunology at VCU. Dr. Hogan has an active practice evaluating all types of allergic disorders and immunodeficiencies. She is passionate about community education and is focused on asthma and food allergies. Nationally, Dr. Hogan has been faculty for many practical pediatrics CME courses and American Academy of Pediatrics National Conference and exhibit meetings. She has also been faculty for the annual meeting of the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. Regionally, she's worked extensively to advocate for the health and safety of children by forming a regional food allergy support group at cofasva.org. In addition, Dr. Hogan has developed, promoted, and participated in multiple outreach programs for schools, EMTs, and community physicians. She is especially proud of the pediatric residents she has mentored and have gone on to fellowship training in allergy and immunology. Dr. Hogan and her husband have 3 adult children and 1 adorable dog. She enjoys music, cooking, crafts, movies, traveling, church, and learning how to play the bagpipes. I think what I really need to find out, Dr. Hogan, is how you find the time to do all of that.
But I'm not very good at the bagpipes yet.
Oh, okay. Well, you have time, I'm sure. We'd like to thank you for being with us today, and we're looking forward to learning something new from your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's get started. I'm really excited about the topic today that I've been asked to present, partly because my firstborn had food allergies, he had asthma, he had eczema, and with my subsequent pregnancies, I was trying to find everything I could find in the literature and talk to everyone I knew about what had I done wrong and was there something that I could do to prevent the onslaught of allergies in my subsequent children. And there has been much written in the last 20 years or so, and there has been a plethora of information that has gone from one side to the other, and it's a very fascinating topic. So I hope to dive into that with you today. This slide is my disclosures that tells you that I do speak for one pharmaceutical company and am on an advisory board for another, but it's not relevant to anything that we're going to talk about today. So, and our objectives are specifically, we want to look at both asthma and food allergies and what are some of the risk factors that have been identified for developing these types of allergies. And I think that in order to start with that, we should at least review what prevention definitions are. So when we talk about prevention of any entity, we talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention aims at stopping the disease before it ever starts. So in the case of allergy, that would be like blocking sensitization. Primary prevention would be also things like immunizations for prevention of infectious diseases, or maybe folic acid supplementation during pregnancy to prevent birth defects. Secondary prevention aims at reducing the development of further disease after there's some inclination that it's beginning. In the case of like allergies, you want to prevent the development of the disease after sensitization has occurred. You basically want to reduce the impact that the disease has after it's already been appreciated. And then tertiary prevention aims at reducing symptoms after the disease is fully expressed. You want to soften the impact of the ongoing disease, like, for example, rehab after a stroke. The reason why I want to point these out, because what we're going to talk about today is primary prevention, and specifically primary prevention as it pertains to both food allergies and asthma. And there are multiple different interactions that go on between genes and the environment, and these interactions together help us understand the development of allergic disease. There are 3 factors that are needed to develop allergic disease. You need to have the appropriate genetic background, you need to have contact with the allergens, and then there have to be multiple environmental factors that are all playing at the same time, including the timing of these factors is very important. And these interactions occur both during pregnancy, in early infancy, and also in early childhood that lead to the development of allergic diseases. So sort of the way I thought we would break this down today is we would look at these interactions between genetics and environment in 3 key time periods. We'd look at prenatal exposures, perinatal exposures, and postnatal exposures. And I can tell you that there are hundreds of things that could have been listed in each of these lists of different factors we look at. But I thought today we'd sort of narrow it down to the ones that sort of get the most press and have the most interest. So we're going to start today with prenatal factors and look at genetics and history and some maternal factors like age and diet and vitamins and medications, and also talk a little bit about epigenetics. So the first question that probably everyone would ask about is it nature versus nurture, and how much of a role do genes play, and is there any particular genes that have been identified that are associated with the development of allergic disease? Well, all of us know that there is no one allergy gene, and that allergies do tend to run in families, and the evidence suggests that genetics do contribute to the development of allergy. Sort of the old adage that we all remember, that if neither parent is allergic, there's about a 25% chance they'll have an allergic child. If one parent is allergic, there's about a 40% chance. And if both parents are allergic, there's about a 60 to 80% chance that they may have an allergic child. But again, that word allergic is used very loosely. We don't know which allergic disease they may have. That's not necessarily passed on genetically. And that what allergic disease they have is influenced by a lot of other genes. And some of those genes are protective, and some of those contribute to the development of disease. We know that there are genes that are regulated in response to the environmental exposures. We know that there are genes that are involved in maintaining the epithelial barrier integrity, and that may influence other exposures, like penetration of allergens or viral components. We know that there are genes that specifically regulate responses to inflammation, whether or not we upregulate inflammation, whether we turn off inflammation when we should. And there are also disease-modifying genes. And all of these genes come into play when we talk about the development of allergy. And we know, again, that the timing and the actual environment plays a significant role in the expression of these genes. And the way that it does that is through epigenetics. So epigenetics are biochemical changes that happen to the DNA expression, but not actually to the DNA sequence. So these are changes that actually happen after the genetic pattern for that individual is known, but it basically is factors that come along and decide which switches are going to be turned on and which switches are going to be turned off, so that you see different patterns of gene expression. All genes can't be expressed simultaneously. And so we know that through epigenetic changes, what is turned on and turned off is influenced by things like stress or diet or prenatal nutrition. And the interesting part about epigenetics is that when these switches have been flipped, they actually can be passed on from one generation to the next, and they can be even in an infant that's not even been thought of yet or conceived, these patterns can be passed on from the parents that or grandparents that are responsible for them. And so some bad behaviors actually can predispose children to disease before they're ever even conceived. So let's look at maternal age. Maternal age in terms of the development of allergy is kind of a dichotomy when we think about it in terms of asthma and in terms of food allergies. What we know from the literature currently is that increasing maternal age at delivery, like over 30, is associated with a lower risk of asthma and higher adult lung function in offspring. So an older mother seems to be more favorable for less risk for asthma, but it just seems to be the opposite for the risk for food allergy. It's been demonstrated that increasing maternal age at delivery has been associated with a higher risk of food allergy and diagnosis in childhood. And that may be related to maybe changes in the microbiome, or possibly maternal BMI or nutritional status or courses of antibiotics. There are a lot of different reasons it's been postulated that there is this difference between asthma and food allergy based on age. Then there's also the question about, well, what about maternal diet and dietary restrictions? Certainly, when I was pregnant with my first children, there were certain foods that it was recommended that you not eat during pregnancy, and by not eating those foods, then you could possibly reduce the risk of having a food allergic child. But that's all changed. There was an important publication in March of 2019 from the American Academy of Pediatrics clinical report from the committees on nutrition and the section on allergy and immunology. And that particular report stated that there is a lack of evidence to suggest that maternal avoidance diets during pregnancy or lactation are effective in preventing allergic disease. And basically what it said is that you should not restrict mom's diet at all for any foods that are considered safe during pregnancy or lactation. There are several studies that indicated that even early exposure to food allergens through the maternal diet, even during the first trimester, may lead to tolerance rather than sensitization to foods. We know that maternal diets that are rich in fruits and vegetables, fish, and foods that contain vitamin D, sort of a Mediterranean dietary pattern, have been associated with lower rates of atopic disease in childhood. So let's spend just a minute and talk about why the Mediterranean diet may be particularly helpful in preventing atopic disease. And a lot of people think that it has to do with polyunsaturated fatty acids. So just to review for you, the main two polyunsaturated fatty acids that we think about are omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids are high in foods like flaxseed, salmon, tuna, sardines, most of your fish family, and also things like chia seeds. And these particular fatty acids have an anti-inflammatory effect in calming the immune system. And this is opposed to omega-6 fatty acids, which are found in a lot of food products like sunflower, soy, sesame seeds, nuts. And these particular fatty acids can have a pro-inflammatory effect. And it's thought that the ratio of omega-3s to omega-6 is important during pregnancy, and that when you have a ratio of omega-3s to omega-6 that advocates more omega-3s or is greater than 1, that can be more protective for the development of allergies. This has been demonstrated in a recent meta-analysis that showed there was a positive trend for the prevention of wheeze and asthma when maternal consumption of omega-3 fatty acids were high during pregnancy. And there was also a recent study called the CANDLE study that looked at mother-child pairs in Memphis, Tennessee. And in this study, they measured maternal plasma levels of omega-3s and omega-6 during the second trimester of pregnancy, and they correlated that with respiratory outcomes or asthma in children when they were 4 to 6 years of age. And what this study found is that the higher the omega-6 levels during pregnancy, then the higher the risk was that the child would be diagnosed with asthma between the ages of 4 and 6. And that this was particularly enhanced whenever the child was a male child, and also if mom had underlying asthma during pregnancy. And those two factors in combination with the higher omega-6 levels seem to be a significant risk factor for the development of asthma. And this is particularly important because this reminds us that a prenatal diet is an easy way to modify the risk for the development of asthma in childhood. And so simply addressing omega-3 acid supplementation in individuals who have asthma, we may be able to prevent the development of asthma in the offspring. Interestingly, though enough, omega-3 fatty acid supplementation did not really impact atopic dermatitis or food allergy. The impact was really mostly seen for asthma. So now let's switch to vitamin D. We know that maternal vitamin D deficiency increases the risk of childhood asthma. Vitamin D supplementation during pregnancy appears to reduce the risk of asthma and recurrent wheezing in the offspring. And we know that low vitamin D levels in cord blood samples have been associated with early onset wheezing and also eczema in infants. And there's also another study that shows asthmatic moms whose vitamin D levels were sufficient in early and late pregnancy, that they had a 65% reduction in the risk of wheezing in their offspring at the age of 3. So clearly vitamin D and asthma go together, and obviously if we can correct and have good vitamin D levels during pregnancy, then we are less likely to see asthma develop. But what about vitamin D and food allergies? Well, in 2020, there was a systematic review and meta-analysis of maternal vitamin D supplementation during pregnancy, and it found that there was a trend towards reduction of allergen sensitization and allergic rhinitis, but no clear impact on the risk of atopic dermatitis or food allergy. But we do know that vitamin D plays critical roles in modulating different immune responses, and that it is crucial for maintaining a healthy microbiome. And there's some interesting data also from Australia. In Australia, they don't fortify their foods with vitamin D. And in Australia, children that live in the southern states where there's less sun have twice the odds of developing a peanut allergy at age 4 to 5, and 3 times the odds of developing an egg allergy than kids who are in the northern areas of Australia. And also, 1-year-old infants with vitamin D levels less than 20 were 3 times more likely to have egg allergy in Australia and 11 times more likely to have peanut allergy than those with normal levels. So although the systematic review has not been able to find a clear-cut relationship with vitamin D, there are several other studies that have demonstrated an impact with low vitamin D levels and the development of food allergies. The problem, as you know, when we do meta-analysis and systematic reviews, is that all different types of studies are thrown into the big hodgepodge analysis, and sometimes there are not enough similarities between those studies that we may lose some of the details because we try to do such a large review. There are isolated studies that say there may be a role for vitamin D supplementation and food allergy prevention. What about prebiotics and probiotics? Well, as you know, probiotics are live microorganisms which, when they're administered in adequate amounts, can confer some benefit to the host. There are lots of probiotic prevention studies that have been done in pregnancy and in newborns. And once again, there's conflicting results. It sort of depends on which strains that are being used and also how many microorganisms and lots of other factors, whether or not the probiotics are protected or are they degraded by the acid in the gut before they ever get to the intestines. But there are several meta-analyses that have generally concurred that probiotics can reduce the risk of eczema, but not other allergic outcomes as clearly, like asthma and allergic rhinitis. And again, there are so many different strains of bacteria that have been looked at, and again, such varying amounts. In general, though, supplementation with prebiotics and probiotics may have some limited improvement, but in general, it does not support a decrease in food allergy. What about maternal medicines? There are some studies that suggest acetaminophen has been associated with an increased risk of early childhood asthma, although the results seem to vary among many studies. There's some concern about acid suppressive medications and that they may be associated with an increased risk of asthma in the offspring because they may alter the flora and the pH and antigen presentation in the gut. And we also know antibiotics may play a role. Antibiotics are known to cause short-term and long-lasting alterations in the microbiota. The association in moms is actually a dose-dependent increase in asthma risk depending upon the number of courses that mom had during pregnancy. There's only a few studies that have explored the relationship between food allergies and antibiotic use. Most of them are observational studies, and there is potentially a link between antibiotic use in pregnancy and early life, but again, it's very limited. So it's difficult to say that there's a huge impact, but there may be an impact in asthma, but for food allergies, we're still waiting for more studies to be done. What about epigenetic changes? One of the things that's been clearly shown to be problematic for the development of allergic disease is tobacco smoke exposure. Prenatal exposure to maternal smoking is a well-established risk factor for childhood asthma. It's been associated with reduced lung function in infants and a much greater likelihood that the child will develop asthma. And the interesting part is that cigarette smoking can cause these epigenetic changes that we talked about earlier, and it can change the immune system for the fetus. And there's even studies that show if maternal grandmother smoked during pregnancy, it increases the risk of asthma in her grandchildren. In a recent systematic review and meta-analysis, there was no association, though, of maternal smoking during pregnancy and food allergies. But passive smoke exposure in infancy was significantly associated with increased risk of food allergy. So overall, we do feel, certainly for asthma, that cigarette smoking has an impact, and the jury is still out for smoking and food allergy development during pregnancy, but early life exposures does have an impact on food allergy. So we've talked about prenatal factors. Let's talk about perinatal factors for just a moment. So let's talk for a second about the hygiene hypothesis. So the hygiene hypothesis, and I love this picture, which is from the New York Times. It shows here the farming wife who is exposed to all sorts of microbes and dirt and even rodents here, and all of this exposure to germs causes her to be very healthy and able to endure all the other threatening exposures without getting sick. And then we see the city folk here who actually who doesn't have all that protection, who easily gets sick because they don't have all of the good dirt exposures to make their immune system much stronger. The hygiene hypothesis says that when we have decreased microbial exposures, then in that response, we have an increase in allergic disease. And these changes have taken place over at least the last century or so because of changes we've had in our environment. And we know that we are moving towards more healthy, quote unquote, from a microbial standpoint environment, because we have clean water, we have the development of sewage systems, we have chlorination of our water, we have broad spectrum antibiotics, we also have treatment and control of food bacterial infections, and we also have immunizations. And all of these things taken together lead to less microbial exposures. And in contrast, many people think of the hygiene hypothesis kind of a yin and yang. And so when you have less microbial exposure, your immune system is bored, and so it doesn't know what to do, so it reacts by becoming more allergic. That's very simplistic, but that's sort of how most of us view the hygiene hypothesis. And it has to do with actually kind of the balance of the immune system on the inside also, and it has to do with our microbiome. And our human microbiome is all of the microbes, the bacteria, the fungi, the viruses, and all of the elements and interactions that they have by living in and on our human body. They're part of the innate immune system that we're born with, and the microbiome directly affects our immune responses and the continued effectiveness of our immune responses. The microbiome helps protect us from overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria. It also maintains a balance between inflammation and the immune homeostasis. Dysbiosis is an alteration in the composition, the diversity, the metabolites of the microbiome so that it shifts out of that balance and is not as favorable. Dysbiosis is believed to play a role in the development of food allergy, asthma, and also eczema. So there are multiple birth cohorts that have demonstrated the relationship between the altered gut microbiota composition in the first years of life and the development of allergy and asthma. This dysbiosis does play a role in the development of asthma, and it may also influence sensitization to different allergens in asthma. And it's a complex interaction, again, based on the timing, the amount of exposure, the location, the abundance, and how much diversity is already there for the microbiome. And there are studies that show bacteria can also cause epigenetic changes, again, turning off some genes and turning on other genes that can lead to allergy or asthma or sensitization, which in turn can lead to the development of allergy. And it's not just the microbiome that's in the gut. We know that all surfaces of the human body have different bacteria, and so it can be the microbiome of the lungs. It's also recently been shown that even the microbiome of the nose can be important in driving immune responses, specifically for early onset rhinitis in children and even asthma. So what bacteria and where they're located and what types are there is very important. So let's talk a little bit about the microbiome in the gut. So each infant is born with a sterile gut. And in the days that follow, there's a massive invasion of bacteria, which is normal and essential. And these bacteria are happy because they have a home and we feed them, and they in turn give us a healthy immune system. But this balance is sabotaged by invading pathogens, and especially influenced when we have antibiotic exposures. It's very interesting. The human adult has 10 times more bacterial cells than they actually have human cells, and that there are hundreds to millions of different bacteria that colonize our body. And interestingly, there are bacteria, for example, in our gut we don't even know the names of yet. We've just beginning to try and understand the diversity and the complexity of the bacteria that are found on our body. So, having said that, it would be natural then to think about the birthing process, and does the birthing process actually affect our microbiome? And there is some studies that say it does. The mode of infant delivery, vaginal versus C-section, does affect what kinds of bacteria we colonize our immune system with. And it's been shown that infants that are delivered by C-section actually have different bacterial colonization than infants who are born vaginally. Infants who are born by C-section have colonization of their gut that tends to look more like the colonization of the skin. And there are several systematic reviews that show an increased risk of developing food allergy, or at least food sensitization, in infants who are delivered by C-section. And there is now some discussion about whether or not there's a difference between emergency C-section versus planned C-section, and perhaps maybe emergency C-section may get different bacteria than those that have planned C-sections. And there's also been data that shows C-sections can also increase the risk of childhood asthma in addition to the risk of food allergy. There was a recent population-based cohort of 1.7 million single births, and it was found that increased risk of childhood asthma was associated with both planned and emergency C-sections. So what about breastfeeding? So obviously, we promote breastfeeding. We think there are a lot of immunological advantages. It helps develop more diverse and friendly bacteria than formula feeding does. Two particular bacteria that we think are very good that are associated with breast milk are Bifido, I'm not saying it right, Bifidobacterium, there we go, and Lactobacillus. And they develop different types of T cells, specifically Treg cells. T regulatory cells are important in tolerance induction and not the development of allergic disease. And those two strains of bacteria we like to have a lot of because they help promote a happy, quiet immune system. However, current evidence shows that breastfeeding in and of itself does not prevent or enhance the risk of food allergy. So because of the nature and multi-factors that have been looked at with breastfeeding, it's not clear-cut that it actually prevents food allergy. It has, however, been associated with a lower incidence of recurrent wheezing during the first 2 years of life, possibly due to maybe fewer viral infections, but it does not have lasting improvement in terms of will they go on to develop asthma later in childhood. There is some evidence, though, that the longer duration of breastfeeding and possibly the mode of breastfeeding, whether they're partially breastfed or exclusively breastfed, may have some differences in protection and potentially may lead to reduction in asthma after 5 years of life. So again, there are multiple studies that give us different pictures. We think overall breastfeeding is good because it helps promote the right bacteria, but hard yes and no answers for breastfeeding preventing food allergy and breastfeeding ultimately developing or preventing the development of asthma is really not there yet. What about antibiotic exposures? Well, obviously, if I told you the bacteria is very important, then if we give antibiotics and disrupt the normal bacteria patterns, then we think that that would probably have an effect on the immune system. And we do know that it does disrupt the microbiota. And we know that infants who are exposed to antibiotics, both pre, peri, or postnatally, there can be an impact on the microbiome, but the exact impact is not completely known again. There was a recent systematic review that reported no significant relationship between antibiotic exposure and increased risk of food allergy. However, there was another recent study, though, that said early antibiotic exposures was associated with a risk of cow's milk allergy, especially if antibiotics were given to infants between birth and 1 month of age. So part of the problem with the conflicting opinion here may be that the systematic review looked at a larger time span, and when you narrow it down to the first month of life, that may be the time period before all the good bacteria have set up shop, when we need to think about antibiotics may play the biggest impact on the development of allergies. And what about the role for asthma? Exposure to antibiotics during infancy has been associated with the development of asthma in later childhood in retrospective studies, but the association did not reach significance when prospective studies looked at exposure to antibiotics and the development of asthma. Some question as to why there was a difference between retrospective and prospective was thought maybe to be recall bias in the moms who were looking at the development of asthma and whether or not they had antibiotics for their infants in the first year of life. But there was a recent report from the Canadian Healthy Infant Birth Cohort Study that looked at 2,600 children, and what they found that was there was a 26% decrease in asthma incidence between 2000 and 2014 in children, and this was what they thought correlated with a reduction in antibiotic use. So in Canada, they had a large promotional medical effort to reduce overuse of antibiotics and promote antibiotic stewardship. And this particular educational time period and dose reduction between 2000 and 2014 is shown here on the blue graph. This is the lessening amount of antibiotic prescriptions. And when they looked at the rate of asthma during that time period, they also saw a significant reduction in asthma incidence rates that seemed to parallel the decrease in antibiotic prescriptions in early childhood. They also found that antibiotic use in the first year of life was associated with almost a doubling the risk of asthma diagnosis at the age of 5, suggesting that there was a clear impact when antibiotics were used and the development of asthma. So what about animal exposures? Again, going to the hygiene hypothesis, we know that the presence of a dog in the house can increase the diversity of bacteria in the GI tract of babies, and also is associated with higher levels of endotoxin, or essentially good dirt. Endotoxin actually is a component of gram-negative bacterial cell walls. It's a marker of microbial exposure, and in general, when there's more endotoxin exposure, then there's less allergy. And what we know in children who have a dog in their house, they are less likely to develop egg allergy than those who don't have a pet in their house. And that in children in another study who had dogs in their house, their risk of food allergy was lessened if they had eczema. And the same thing was observed if they had cats in their house and had eczema, then they were at a reduced risk for development of food allergies. There are a few observational studies that have related to living on a farm, and the most recent data suggests that living on a farm doesn't really protect you against the development of food allergies, But we do know that there are studies that exploring animal exposures and food allergies are very inconsistent. And again, it may be due to the design of those studies, and more information is going to be coming out. What about animal exposures and asthma? We know that air or allergen sensitization before the age of 5 significantly increases the risk of asthma and the persistence of asthma into adolescence. There are complex interactions between environmental factors, timing, dose, genetic predisposition. And in a recent large birth cohort, it showed that having a dog in the house in the first year of life was associated with a reduced risk of developing asthma and allergic disease by the age of 5. But the same was not true in this particular study for cats. Cats only reduce the risk for eczema and not for asthma. So we've talked a little bit about perinatal. Let's now move on and talk about postnatal exposures. Again, for postnatal exposures, we think that it is important to not restrict mom's diet during lactation. It does not prevent the development of allergic disease. And then the question comes up for how long to breastfeed before you introduce complementary foods. We used to say 6 months, but now we know that the current recommendations are that there's no advantage for postponing introduction of foods beyond 3 to 4 months for the prevention of atopic diseases. What about infant formulas? There was a 2016 meta-analysis that includes 37 studies that demonstrated that partially or extensively hydrolyzed formulas do not reduce the risk of allergic outcomes in high-risk infants, and the use of hypoallergenic formulas to prevent allergic disease is no longer recommended or supported by the AAP. So now let's spend just a few minutes talking about actual feeding of the infants complementary foods. And what we know is that as you introduce different food allergens, there are individuals that are going to be sensitized. And with re-exposure, there are some babies that are going to have clinical reactions like eczema or possibly a systemic reaction. There are some babies with re-exposure that are going to have no reactions or disease. And there are some babies with exposure to the allergens who absolutely get no sensitization whatsoever. And the differences in this is very confusing, and many people are trying to postulate and understand why. And it may have to do with the timing of introduction. So in a nutshell, we've certainly changed our opinion. In the 1960s, we said don't introduce foods until after 2 months of life. In the 70s, we said, oh, don't introduce solids until after 4 months of life. In the 1990s, we moved that out to 6 months. And in 2000, we recommended even longer for certain highly allergenic foods like milk 1 year, 2 years for eggs, and 3 years for peanuts. But in 2008, the AAP said there really is no evidence for delaying the introduction of solid foods beyond 4 to 6 months in response to a decade of increasing allergy prevalence in children, a significant increase that happened after we implemented the recommendations in 2000. So in response to that, there was a study that was performed called the LEAP study, which was learning early about peanut allergy. And this particular trial was essential because it tried to prove that postponing the introduction of foods was bad, specifically for peanut. In this particular study, and I'm sure most of you all know about this study, it selected children that were considered to be high risk for food allergy. These were kids that had eczema and egg allergy, and it skin tested them to see if they were sensitized or not sensitized in the initial phases of the study, which was between 4 and 11 months. And then it divided them into 2 groups. One group wasn't going to eat peanut until they were 5, and the other group would eat peanut 3 times a week until they were 5. And then at the age of 5, they looked at both groups to see who was allergic to peanut and who wasn't. And what they found is that overall, in patients that both had an initial positive skin test and those who did not, at the 5-year mark, in the infants who were fed peanut 3 times a week, there was an relative risk reduction of 81%. So much, much fewer kids developed peanut allergy when they were introduced to the food protein early and continued it in their diet. And so that led us to our most recent recommendations, which were based on high-risk infants. And in high-risk infants, the recommendations were if the infants had severe eczema or egg allergy or both, we should screen them either by blood test or skin test and make sure that they get the food introduced into their diet early. If infants had mild to moderate eczema, we didn't necessarily say they needed to be screened, but suggested that they do have early introduction. And if infants had no eczema or food allergy, the foods could be introduced whenever the family felt was age appropriate. And the way that we introduced foods either were with things called Bomba, which were Cheetos made out of peanut protein, or smooth peanut butter, or possibly peanut powder or peanut flour. And they were to continue to eat those 3 times a week. And basically in 2019, the AAP Committee on Nutrition said that early introduction of peanuts can prevent peanut allergy, and that we do need to push individuals to go ahead and introduce these foods, specifically peanut, at least in high risk infants, and that there was no evidence that delaying introduction prevented the development of atopic disease. But there have been some new consensus guidelines that were actually published at the beginning of this year. And the new consensus guidelines from the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, and the Canadian Allergy Society said, you know, we really should stop focusing on high-risk individuals and low risk. We really should introduce peanut-containing products to all infants, regardless of their risk of developing peanut allergy, starting somewhere around 6 months of life, but not before 4 months of life. And they also, based on the evidence that has been shown, suggested that egg and egg-containing products should be introduced to the infants also in this early time period if we're going to help prevent egg and peanut allergy. And then the question comes up, well, what about other foods? What if early introduction of egg and peanut is important? Should we be worried about introducing other foods? Well, it was demonstrated that even if you introduced egg and peanut early, there was no increased association of other food allergy risks. And it also showed from multiple studies that early fish introduction was not associated with a reduced allergenic sensitization. And also the timing of wheat does not seem to be important, and there's not an associated risk of celiac disease or other food allergy to wheat based on the timing of wheat. It really seems to be important for egg and peanut. So in this slide here, it sort of summarizes trends that we have seen. You can see that there are factors that are shown to increase the risk of food allergy. This may be small families, C-section, over cleaning things, antibiotics, and there are factors that may be associated with reducing the risk of food allergy. And this may be potentially probiotics, having good exposure to a variety and abundance of bacteria. Certainly, pets in the home may reduce the risk for food allergy. And sort of in summary then, we need to look at a couple more factors for postnatal exposures, at least due to asthma. And this would be allergen, viruses, and air pollution. And what we know that early life exposures can develop influence the allergic disease development specifically for asthma. We know that allergens are important. We also know that air pollution and tobacco smoke and also things like diesel fuel can impact and change our immune system and lead us more towards a path of asthma. We've already sort of talked about the microbiome also. We also know that viruses play an extremely important role in the development of asthma, especially in the first year of life. Is it which virus or how many? That's an excellent question. We do know that RSV and rhinovirus have been especially associated with significant risk for asthma, and that rhinovirus-induced wheezing is very important for the development of future asthma. And we also know that indoor allergens can play a significant role in the development of asthma in children in combination with recurrent wheezing. And then again, as I mentioned, tobacco smoke, again, is very important. Secondhand smoke is very important. Cigarette smoking, as we mentioned, can change epigenetic manifestations and can change the immune development in the fetus. And we also know that even e-cigarettes used during pregnancy are dangerous to fetal lung development and have been associated with an increased risk of asthma in childhood. So let's put it all together. So what do we know? We know that factors are important and confusing in all three time periods, both prenatal, postnatal, and perinatal. And so what would I tell parents that they could do to decrease the risk of food allergies and asthma to children? I would say that there's some pretty good evidence that you should minimize antibiotics during pregnancy. If you don't need antibiotics, don't take them. Potentially skip acetaminophen unless you really have a bad headache or really feel like that it's necessary, or at least try to reduce your exposures to that. It's important to have a balanced maternal diet with a wide range of fruits and vegetables and fish. That probably omega-3s are an important thing to consider in your diet, and that may be helpful in reducing the risk for the development of asthma. That we shouldn't restrict the diet and say, don't eat those high allergenic foods. That certainly is the wrong thing to say. We want individuals to eat all foods. Certainly avoiding cigarette smoking is very important. You need to get some sunlight. And if you're not getting sunlight, then you need to make sure that you have an adequate vitamin D source or supplementation during pregnancy in order to reduce the risk for allergic disease. Consider delivering vaginally if possible, but obviously we want the safest outcomes as possible, which then maybe that brings up a question about vaginal seeding or some other things, which are time for another discussion at some other time. I think breastfeeding for at least 4 months has been demonstrated to have some added benefit. Potentially having a dog in your house, especially during the first year of life, may have some added protective benefits, although don't rush out and get a dog for everyone. I think introducing egg and peanut between 4 to 6 months of life seems to be a very important thing to do for all infants. And then in infants or families of infants that are concerned about early introduction, they should probably be referred to an allergist so that the allergist can do screening and help that family go ahead and introduce the foods that they may be hesitant to do so, because there is a magical window, it looks like, when these high-risk foods should be introduced in order to reduce the risk for food allergies. So kind of a big topic that we covered in a short time period, but hopefully you got an overview that there's a lot of fascinating information out there of different things that can impact whether or not the child develops food allergies and asthma, and so many ongoing research studies hopefully will give us more clear-cut answers with time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hogan. We're now going to be able to take our listeners' questions. Okay, our first question is, how does diet during pregnancy impact the development of atopic diseases in babies? And are there foods pregnant women should consume to help with this?
So what we think is that women should just eat a diverse diet, and that there are no foods that are off limits, other than obviously we don't want to eat foods that are high in mercury or, considered to be, like alcohol and things like that. But we think that it is this broad exposure to many allergens that is really the most beneficial to the fetus.
Okay, thank you. And do prenatal antibiotics and antibiotics given to infants impact the development of atopic diseases in babies? Do antibiotics put them at a higher risk for atopic disease?
So the discussion is that probably antibiotics do change the microbiome. And because of that exposure, we may see increased development potentially of allergies. It's important to know that these exposures to the antibiotics affect the diversity of the bacteria that colonizes multiple surfaces in the human body. And because that may allow pathogens to come in and override good bacteria, and they may have dampening of the immune responses that we want. So we think that antibiotics, and it's a dose-dependent relationship. We think that antibiotics during pregnancy, the more exposures that you have, the increased likelihood of having an allergic child occurs. And we also think that antibiotics, especially during the first month of life, may have an impact on the development of atopic disease in the child.
Thank you. Oh, this is just so fascinating. The next question is more of one for the webinar itself. Is someone's asking if the link or the presentation slides will be available. We will have a link so that you can watch it again. Because it is a CME activity, we cannot give you the slides, but you can listen again and you can go nice and slowly and stop it and take notes as much as you'd like. So Dr. Hogan, we have another question. How does preterm birth play into the asthmatic symptoms and signs?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So it's not something that's really been well studied. Certainly, if we have preterm birth, and because they're so premature that they end up having to be rushed off to the NICU, and they're in the cubicle and have a lot of more sterile environment or more protected environment, that could lead potentially to less colonization with more diverse bacteria. And that potentially could alter the microbiome and lead to more allergic disease. But specifically, being born prematurely doesn't necessarily mean that the immune system isn't capable of working correctly, but we think that those decreased exposures may play a role and lead to less diverse microbiota.
Okay. Next question is from a grandmother, and she says, my grandson is 8 months old and recently found out that he's allergic to egg whites and almonds. Will he grow out of this possibly?
Yes, he may very well outgrow those. Especially since he's only 8 months old. And there is a lot of evidence that suggests that almond actually may not even be a tree nut and may be more readily outgrown than the other tree nuts. It's really more in a different family, so we see it outgrown more frequently than the other tree nuts. And egg certainly is readily outgrown in many children. Sometimes by about the age of 3 to 5. Certainly, I would speak with your allergist and discuss perhaps maybe if exposure to baked egg products might be an option. There are conflicting reports, but some studies that suggest potentially being able to eat baked eggs safely may help drive the egg allergy away more quickly. So I certainly wouldn't do that at home without talking to your allergist, but yes, I would be very optimistic that your grandson may outgrow his egg and almond allergy.
Okay, our next question is, what about mastitis that is reoccurrent in the breastfeeding mom? Do you recommend prevention or natural solutions other than antibiotics?
Well, I think it depends on the severity of the mastitis. Certainly, I would try to do natural solutions if you could, warm compresses, try to, express as much milk as you can until it's no longer tender and you're able to let the infant nurse again. I think anything you can do to try and not get antibiotics, if it's effective, would be ideal. But, sometimes there comes a time when you just need antibiotics in order to be able to continue nursing. And I think it's more important to continue nursing. So I would not withhold antibiotics to the mom just because there's mastitis. The ideal solution would be to be able to treat it and then continue nursing.
Oh, Dr. Hogan, thank you so much for joining us today. That's all the time that we have for questions. We really appreciate you being with us today. And I would like to
Thank
thank
you
our
very
listeners.
much.
We'd like to thank our listeners for joining us today as well. At this time, please download the certificate of attendance from your control panel. If you have any difficulties, please email us using the link in your emails. You can join us next month as we look at what we've learned about telemedicine and asthma care. This webinar will air on Thursday, July 29th at 4:00 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register for this webinar on our website at allergyasthmanetwork.org. Look for news in the horizontal navigational bar near the top of the page and scroll to webinars. You can also view our recorded webinars on this page of our website. Visit our website for quality guidelines-based resources on allergy and asthma. Also access important medical information on allergies and asthma from our partners, the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology at allergyandasthmarelief.org. Please stay on the line to complete our evaluation survey. We use that data to inform planning our other webinars. But thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to having you register to be with us next time on Advances in Allergy and Asthma. This is Sally Schessler for the staff at Allergy and Asthma Network, working each day so we can all breathe better together.